Hello, and welcome to TAR Talk on the ACEDS webinar channel, or the ACEDS friendly front porch, if you will. We have two wonderful gentlemen to talk with us today. It's going to be a short webinar on TAR and not the mechanics of TAR, but more on the art and science of getting a new technology acknowledged by the court. Back in the day, we were wondering about TAR, wondering about whether TAR would be accepted by our jurists. Certainly, attorneys were worried that nobody had done it before and no court had said anything about it. This first podcast that we're doing is going to cover how in the world did this get blessed by a court in global aerospace. And to do that, we have the inimitable John Tredenick. John is the founder of Catalyst. He laughs. But he also was a partner and a trial lawyer, and he's written like crazy, all sorts of different books, TAR for Smart People, User's Guide for TAR, and in the early days, some of the early ABA tech publications, and he's won a number of awards, an e-discovery trailblazer, legal visionary, and as he puts it, when he's not sitting on his virtual porch, you will find him competing on the National Equestrian Show, jumping circuit, or playing drums and singing in a classic rock jam band. So those of you who are on live, you may find some John Tredenick music in the recorded version of our podcast. And Tom Grix, Tom carried the heavy water to get the global aerospace case in the situation that it ended up in, and he's going to tell us about the behind-the-scenes aspect. And prior to Catalyst, John was a trial lawyer with Schneider, Harrison, Siegel, and Lewis, an early adopter of e-discovery, and he was the chair of their e-discovery practice group. So we are definitely interested in how this all came about, and I'm going to turn it over to John Tredenick, who will be interviewing his very good friend, Tom Grix, on how all this happened. He's promised not to insult Tom at all.
Yeah.
John?
Well, thank you. Thank you, Mary, and welcome everybody to the inaugural edition of TAR Talk, a 15-minute or so podcast where we tell jokes, bad jokes, we make even worse metaphors, make fun of each other, and we'll try to somewhere in there fit in something useful to you about legal technology, TAR, and beyond TAR and techniques. So TAR Talk's meant to be a lot of fun. The only thing I promise you we won't do is give you advice on how to fix your car. So I want to thank Mary, I want to thank ACEDS for supporting us and letting us use their virtual porch. We've greased up the rockers. I've got Tom and Mary, and we are rocking as I say this out there on that virtual porch and having a couple virtual beverages as well. Tom, are you having your Macallan with that big chunk of ice today?
I decided to go with Lafroig. It's a little smoky, and you know me, I'm going to throw up a smoke screen through all of this and see if we can wade through it. So that's my choice today.
Well, unlike you elite East Coast guys, I'm having a Budweiser long neck. Mary, what are you drinking today?
John, it's 10 o'clock in the morning. I'm an orange juice kind of gal today.
Not on our virtual porch. It's always 5 o'clock somewhere here. Hey, Tom, I bumped into this Wall Street Journal article from June of 2012 called Why Hire a Lawyer? Computers Are Cheaper. And it has your name under a picture, but it's the ugliest picture I've ever seen. It would scare children if you let them loose. But tell me, how did you get in that Wall Street Journal talking about dumping lawyers because computers are cheaper?
That was very kind of you, John. Thank you for that. As we were talking about what we might talk about today, that reminds me that what I was thinking of, and would probably make sense given your observations, is this is really like Tales from the Crypt, right? Because this was back in the old days. I mean, it really was early on in the process, and And this whole process really it was kind of fun because it really started for me. Because if you remember back in those days, nobody was really very comfortable with targeted search. They weren't comfortable with targeted collection. So, man, we had collected just boatloads of data. I think we collected 8 terabytes of data to make sure we didn't miss anything because nobody organized anything with the ESI that we were working with. And when we cut it down as much as we could on file types and everything else that was out there, I looked at that, and it was about 2 million documents. And I looked.
And which case was this, Tom?
This was the global aerospace. So that's what really started this. There would be I will tell you right now, and anyone who's listening heard it here. This was the first case in the country that authorized the use of technology-assisted review or predictive coding over the opposition of the other side. Take that, Judge Peck. So
we're going to have Judge Peck on. We're going to have Judge Peck on one of these times soon to give him equal opportunity to deny that allegation. But here's my question, Tom. We're going way back when. How the heck did a piker from Pittsburgh, no less, even hear about tar, let alone be the first to use it? Can you tell me that one? I've wanted to ask you for years, but only when I was far enough that you couldn't take a swing at me.
Right. You mean Pittsburgh as opposed to that thriving metropolis and hotbed of e-discovery, Denver, right? I understand.
We talk about different kind of tar in Denver, but it's legal here, so we can.
You know, it was actually kind of interesting. I started working with a client who was really devoted to trying to get honestly on the bleeding edge of technology. So we ended up spending months and months and months basically researching, reading, going around the country to seminars to get up to speed on technology-assisted review because they had a bunch of litigation. They wanted a lot of things to be done, too many documents, and the like. And so they knew they couldn't do linear review. So we became, the folks that were working on that project became really involved and invested in technology-assisted review. And when this case came up, by that time I'd actually gone to the firm and said, guys, we have to look at this. We've got to start thinking about using this because this is going to save time and money. By the way, the backstory to that is, since I was in-house for several years, I'm very attuned to budgets and reserves. So I was all about trying to find ways to save time and money. And, John, you're a trial lawyer. I don't like discovery. You don't like discovery. The whole key is to get into court. So I was lucky enough to be involved with this client and get through this whole kind of knowledge base on technology-assisted review. And when Global came in and we had 2 million documents and had to figure out how to find the ones that really mattered, I said, man, this is absolutely fantastic. We ought to do this and go ahead and use it for this case.
Let me add to that for our audience that we're talking about a pure pointy-headed engineer with a pocket protector who's just pretending like he's a lawyer. So you can imagine when this stuff came out, the guy thought he had died and gone to heaven.
It was bad. I remember going back to that Wall Street Journal article, I remember when Joe Palazzolo asked me, why do you actually believe in this stuff? And I said, listen, I went to engineering school, and I once had a professor that told me, give me enough variables, and I can model anything. And, I believed him because I saw how we did it. And I said to him, the fact is there are a lot smarter people than me out there trying to figure out how to model responsive documents, and they're making it work. And that's kind of how I decided to combine the engineering and legal to try to push this all the way through.
So this was back in what, 2011, 10,
yeah,
12?
11, 12.
And how'd you bump into our friend Herb Roitblatt and decide to go with basically what we now call a TAR 1.0 algorithm or application?
It was interesting because I'm sure you know Carl Shinneman. Lots of folks probably hearing this know Carl. And Carl and I had been working through this other client to really kind of figure out what we might want to do with predictive coding at the time. And Carl really kind of knew Quinn Greger, who was down there at Orcatech, Herb Royblatt, who was down there, and introduced me. And I went down and visited, and we started talking about how this whole process worked. And there were several tools that were out there that were really being pushed hard on the market, but of course there were issues with all of them, for me anyway, personally. So, for example, one of them was Equivio, and with Equivio, it's a SAL tool, and you have to figure out where to draw the line. And all I could think of is, this is going to be the first case in the country. All I can do is screw up, all right? I don't want to draw the line, all right? I want to make sure I don't miss anything, and I can do as best I can to find whatever sits in there, and can walk up to the judge and say, I made every effort to find these documents, did everything I possibly could. If you remember, Orcatech was an SPL tool, a random tool, and in my view, at the time, that was the best way for me to get through documents and make sure that I saw a full cross-section of the database, of the collection, and was getting penetration, so I was seeing things that might exist there that I might not have any clue about. So that's kind of how that whole process worked. Got introduced, it seemed to satisfy my objectives, and went from there.
How many docs did you have in global aerospace, and how the heck did you breach the subject with judge and opposing counsel when probably neither of them had heard anything about this?
It was this was actually, I had to first breach it with my firm, right? Because the lead marriage counsel was a good friend and former partner of mine by the name of John Stern. And John and I talked frequently. I was actually working merits on the case as well as e-discovery, construction case. That was stuff that I did. So I talked to John about it, and I said, I was telling him how this whole process works. So he called me one day, and he said, so you actually think this stuff works? And I said, well, yeah, I do. He said, you want to try? I said, I would love to. So I called the opposing counsel, and I said, hey, this is what I want to do. And if you remember, this was like really early on. I was worried about being challenged. So I essentially said to the guy, you can basically see whatever you want. Not going to give you anything privileged, not going to give you anything sensitive. But look, any decisions I make, apart from that, you can look at them, make a decision, see if you agree. We'll run it until you're satisfied. And his answer to me was, I just don't feel comfortable with that stuff. So I said, and this is just my habit. I said to him, I said, look, if you don't want to let me do it, I'm going to ask the judge. So I did. I asked the judge. And the theory was, I had to lay it all out in the brief, right? I had to really make the brief clear about why this was effective, efficient, and satisfied Rule 1, which essentially had a counterpart in state court in Virginia, which is where this was in Loudoun County.
And let me note, when you talk about the brief, you're in front of a state court judge. I went to school at UVA, and my recollection is some of those judges didn't even know how to read. Did you have any problem with that? Giving a state court judge a big brief?
I'll tell you this was Judge Chamblin, and he was fantastic. It was very clear when we walked in that he had already read all the materials, was very familiar with what was going on, which frankly was fortunate for me because as it ended up, he essentially cut my time down for 3 witnesses, mind you, to 10 minutes. So I pretty much had to rely on my brief, which is what I told him. I said, if you want to talk to these guys, they're just going to tell you everything I put in my brief is right. And so that's what we really relied on, and I put it to the judge in terms of why we really needed to do it. And at the end of the day, you've been there as well as I have. It took a while, but finally, as I'm listening, I found out that I won the motion. So it was I was on the edge of my seat for a little while there.
So hopefully you shut up once you figured out you were winning.
Hey, I shut up long before that because the judge was talking. So,
jump in there, Mary.
I want to see the briefs.
We might share those.
That brief is absolutely available. I've got it in a special place on my computer here, and frankly, it can be updated, of course, because it was 12. But a fairly straightforward and in-depth analysis for why you would actually want to do this.
Maybe we can post it on our website and ACID site in conjunction with this podcast. So, real quick, Tom, did it work? And what'd you get out of it before we wrap up for today?
It absolutely worked. I had a partner of mine who did all of the review. By the way, he was getting up to 250 docs an hour just looking at documents on a doc level, making responsiveness decisions. We ended up looking at about 5,000 documents because, of course, this was a TAR1 tool. Put out, we hit the button. It threw about 175,000 documents out as potentially responsive, and that ended up being about 80% recall at the end of the day.
Wow. So after all this, you ended up reviewing 5,000 documents out of a total of how many?
Out of 2 million. Plus, we reviewed the 180,000 that came out as presumptively relevant.
But saved on the rest of it, which is what makes TAR so important here. Now, one of the things we're going to do in our next podcast is talk about some of the limits of the TAR 1.0 system, and then talk about how TAR 2.0 came about, continuous learning, how we came to develop such a system, and our friends Maura Grossman and Gordon Cormack. In a parallel track, we're doing much the same. But I think it'll be very fun to dig into how that came about and what problems we were trying to solve. But that's it today for TAR Talk. Thank you, Tom. That was fun. We're going to be doing this twice a month. We'll hit lots of topics and invite lots of guests and even have call-ins. And I want to thank our friends at ACIDS, Mary and Kaylee and everybody there, the great folks. We love working with them. And turn it back to you to wrap us up, Mary. That's TAR Talk for today. Thank you all.
Well, thank you, John, and thank you, Tom. What a great start for our podcast, and I'm looking forward to next time, and we may need to answer some of the questions that came in. There was a question, Tom Grix, about what happened to your beard in the Wall Street Journal photo. So not sure if we'll get to that topic next week, but I just raise it just in case, and we'll see you next time for TAR Talk on the ACIDS Podcast Network.
Bye-bye.
See y'all.